Okay, let's just jump right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're looking at a single sporting event that didn't just break a country's heart, it literally rewired its entire cultural DNA. We're talking about July 16, 1950, a date forever etched in history as the Maracanazo. Today, we're going to explore exactly why this specific football match was a total sociological earthquake, how it completely changed Brazil, and how it transformed a moment of profound national shame into the birth of an absolute global empire. To really wrap our heads around the sheer scale of what happened, we have to start right here. This quote from Uruguayan winger Alcides Ghiggia is just legendary. He famously said, "Only 3 people have ever been able to silence the Maracana: the Pope, Frank Sinatra, and me." Ghiggia scored the winning goal that day, and that resulting silence from nearly 200,000 people, it wasn't just disappointment. It was pure, unadulterated shock. So let's look at exactly how Brazil set themselves up for this unbelievable fall. Section 1, the unthinkable defeat, and Brazil's massive hubris. To grasp the tragedy of 1950, you first have to understand the sheer, towering arrogance leading up to it. The Maracanã Stadium was built specifically for this 1950 World Cup, but it was way more than just a sports venue. It was designed as this monumental temple of dreams with a capacity of nearly 200,000 spectators, which, by the way, made it the absolute largest in the world at the time. It was intended to showcase Brazil as this brand new global power. The final match wasn't supposed to be a competition. It was supposed to be a guaranteed coronation. I mean, Brazil had this absolute sheer certainty that they were going to win. Because of a unique round-robin format that year, Brazil literally only needed a draw against Uruguay to take the title. Plus, they had just absolutely demolished Sweden 7-1 and Spain 6-1. The entire nation was so confident that, get this, 22 gold medals were pre-minted with the Brazilian players' names already on them. Politicians were actually out there delivering victory speeches before kickoff. There was even a fully rehearsed victory song titled "Brazil the Victors" just waiting to be blasted. It was the ultimate premature celebration. So the match begins. Let's walk through this emotional whiplash. After a really tense, scoreless first half, Brazil's Firaça scores in the 47th minute. The stadium absolutely erupts into delirium. The coronation is finally happening, right? But then, out of nowhere in the 66th minute, Uruguay's Juan Alberto Schiaffino equalizes. Suddenly, the nerves start to set in. And then comes the 79th minute. Alcides Ghiggia receives the ball, sprints down the right flank, and fires a low shot. It finds the net. 2-1 Uruguay. The final whistle blows, and that deafening, infamous silence falls over the stadium. People in the stands were literally crying inconsolably. Which brings us to Section 2, the tragic scapegoat, Moacir Barbosa. You know, when a nation experiences a trauma this deep, they almost always demand someone to blame. And that incredibly heavy burden fell on one man, Brazilian goalkeeper Moacir Barbosa. Now, before the final, Barbosa had been absolutely rock solid. He played every single minute of the tournament, keeping 2 clean sheets and helping the team dominate completely. But on Ghiggia's goal, Barbosa anticipated a cross, which just left a tiny gap at his near post. It was a rare, split-second lapse in concentration. But for that single moment, he became a national pariah. The scapegoating he faced was just relentless, and it lasted his entire life. Decades later, in this truly heartbreaking moment, captured in a documentary, Barbosa was just shopping in a supermarket when a mother pointed him out to her child and literally said, "Look at him, son. He's the man that made all of Brazil cry." Can you even imagine carrying that weight? He was completely ostracized. He was even banned from visiting the national team's training camp years later just because he was considered bad luck. And this perfectly illustrates the tragic irony of his whole life. Moacir Barbosa was objectively a brilliant player. He was actually voted Brazil's 3rd best goalkeeper of the entire 20th century. Yet he lived out his days as a virtual outcast in his own country, shackled for 50 years to one single mistake he made on a sunny afternoon in 1950. The nation simply couldn't process their immense grief, so they just placed it entirely on his shoulders. Let's move on to Section 3, the mongrel complex and Brazil's shattered psyche. So the fallout from this match went way beyond just one man. Following the Maracanazo, the famous Brazilian playwright and journalist Nelson Rodrigues coined a term that would absolutely define the nation's psyche going forward: complexo de vira-lata, or the mongrel complex. He used the metaphor of a vira-lata, which is a scruffy mixed-breed street dog, to describe how Brazilians started viewing themselves. Rodrigues argued that the defeat triggered this massive collective inferiority complex where Brazilians basically voluntarily lowered themselves when facing the rest of the world. This cultural trauma manifested in two really distinct ways. First, there was a desperate idealization of foreign models, basically uncritically preferring imported goods, European standards, and just assuming foreign supremacy across the board. Second, there was extreme self-deprecation. The society actually began to doubt its own hybrid identity, attributing literally any dysfunction or failure to some inherent flaw in the Brazilian essence. The Maracanazo hadn't just lost them a trophy, it had completely fractured their collective psyche. Section 4. Rebirth of an Empire. From shame to glory. But here's the thing. From this absolute lowest point, something truly remarkable happened. The first step to rebirth was actually an act of pure superstitious pique. Those white jerseys Brazil wore during the 1950 final, they were deemed entirely cursed, and the team just completely discarded them. In their place, a designer named Alcides Ghiggia created what would go on to become the most famous uniform in sports history, the iconic yellow jersey with the blue shorts. It was a literal shedding of the past, burying the memory of that failure right under a vibrant, brand new identity. But as we all know, just changing a shirt isn't enough, right? The actual culture of the game had to evolve. The deep wound of 1950 actually fueled a totally new street-level football culture. Kids playing with rag balls in favelas and on beaches began playing with this desperate dream to eventually wear that new yellow jersey and settle the score for their country. This relentless determination, fueled by raw creativity and incredible physical instinct, gave birth to Jogo Bonito, the beautiful game. And the absolute crucial takeaway here is that this new philosophy worked. I mean, it really, really worked. Over the decades that followed, Brazil went on to win the World Cup an astonishing 5 times. That's right, 5. They took their greatest national shame and quite literally used it as the fuel to achieve unmatched global dominance. This new era birthed absolute generations of global legends. Starting in 1958, which was just 8 years after the Maracanazo, a young kid named Pelé arrived on the scene. Alongside greats like Didi and Garrincha, they completely captivated the globe. And later generations brought us icons like Romario and Ronaldo. It's almost like the trauma of 1950 forced the nation to produce the greatest players in the history of the sport just to prove to themselves and to the world that they absolutely weren't inferior. Which leads us to our final section, exercising the phantom. Yet, despite all those shiny new trophies, the ghost remained. Changing a shirt and winning titles couldn't just magically erase a deep psychological fear. For over 60 years, a phenomenon known as the Phantom of 50 existed. It was an irrational but completely undeniable generational haunting. Basically, whenever Brazil faced Uruguay, this deep cultural dread just hovered over the nation. They were absolutely terrified that the ghost was waiting in the shadows to strike again. Astonishingly enough, it actually took another massive disaster on home soil to finally put 1950 into perspective. Fast forward to 2014, Brazil hosts the World Cup again, and they suffer this totally unimaginable 1-7 collapse against Germany in the semifinals, an event quickly dubbed the Maracanazo. But the contrast between these two events is staggering. 1950 was treated as a deeply traumatic, life-altering tragedy that sparked real national mourning. But the 2014 loss, it was largely treated as a satire. It became an internet meme almost instantly. What you should really take away from this is how the 2014 disaster unexpectedly proved that Brazilian society had finally matured. The public didn't treat the modern players as pariahs the way they did to the guys in 1950. In fact, Moacir Barbosa's adoptive daughter even noted that the 2014 humiliation was finally enough to redeem her father's legacy. The media and the public looked back at that 1950 squad, who remember only lost by 1 goal to a truly brilliant Uruguayan side, and they finally truly forgave them. And that brings us to our final thought for today. The Maracanazo was a devastating blow, no doubt. But it's so vital to ask, would the world have fallen in love with Brazilian football's glorious imperfections if they hadn't suffered this defining tragedy? I mean, perhaps we wouldn't have been able to stomach a relentless 5-time champion if there wasn't something deeply human, a nagging vulnerability, lingering right beneath all those victories. Ultimately, the tears of 1950 didn't destroy Brazil. They gave the nation its soul. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I will catch you on the next one.